The year was 1872. 5 years after the incident that had scorched his soul and his small-town reputation, Elias Thorne still lived by the clockwork rhythm of his grief. Black Creek, Pennsylvania, was a place where winter arrived early and stayed late, clinging to the dilapidated wooden facades and the thick, suffocating air of the Allegheny Mountains. It was a town of whispers, mostly about the incident, and Elias was the focal point. The silent, gaunt man who had lost everything to the rigid, fear-mongering piety of the era. Elias was a former watchmaker, a profession that demanded meticulous precision. Now, his precision was devoted to a different kind of mechanism: vengeance. He stood in the gloom of his isolated cottage workshop, the only light filtering through a grime-streaked window. The air hung heavy with the smell of sawdust, old oil, and a faint acrid scent of burnt wood, a ghost of the night that had changed his life. On his workbench, beside the tools of his abandoned trade, tiny screwdrivers, gears, and springs, lay his current obsession: a meticulously organized collection of newspaper clippings and legal documents. They detailed the trial and subsequent acquittal of 3 men: Reverend Silas Albright, Father Thomas Dwyer, and Dr. Gideon Hale, the self-proclaimed Exorcists, who, in the summer of 1867, had performed an aggressive ritual on his only daughter, 7-year-old Clara, convincing the panicked, fever-stricken townsfolk she was possessed. The ritual had gone disastrously wrong, ending in a catastrophic fire. Clara hadn't been possessed. She had been gravely ill with a virulent fever. But in the hysteria of a community desperate for a scapegoat for their own misfortune, Elias's pleas had been drowned out by their fervent conviction. He ran a calloused thumb over a brittle clipping, a grainy, woodcut image of the 3 men. Albright, the firebrand preacher, eyes ablaze with zeal. Dwyer, the stoic Catholic priest, whose silence had been as damning as Albright's shouts. And Hale, the opportunistic physician, who had provided the false medical justification. They had used fear as their weapon, and the law designed to protect the innocent had ultimately protected them. The jury, comprised of local, God-fearing men, had ruled Clara's death an accidental, if regrettable, consequence of a desperate attempt to save her soul. Elias closed his eyes, remembering the last time he'd held Clara. Her small body was shaking, not with demonic rage, but with a child's terror. He had failed to protect her then, but he wouldn't fail now. He opened a locked drawer and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. It was his operational log, titled simply, The Accounting. Entry, October 4th, 1872. Location, Black Creek, PA. Target, Silas Albright. Status, established new residence and routine in Lancaster, PA. Now operating a small itinerant ministry. His vanity remains his weakness. He craves larger audiences. Elias had spent the last 5 years in a rigorous, self-imposed apprenticeship of observation. He had studied criminal procedure, forensic details of the fire, and most importantly, the psychological profiles and routines of the 3 men. He wasn't after a crude, vengeful act. That would only land him where the Exorcists should have been. Elias was after a justice that mirrored his own meticulous nature. A justice that would expose their guilt and break them piece by agonizing piece, all while maintaining his own anonymity. His plan was a complex multi-stage mechanism, timed to expose the rotten core of each man's life, leading to a breakdown that would force them to confront their actions, or worse, expose them to the very communities they now sought to control. That afternoon, he packed his few possessions into a sturdy valise. He was leaving Black Creek, a town that felt less like a home and more like an open grave. He wore a heavy, dark wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face, a deliberate choice in a place where recognition brought only painful pity or cold judgment. As he walked the familiar muddy lane leading out of town, the mist began to roll in from the mountains, dense and cold. He paused at the town limit sign, its faded letters barely visible. Black Creek, founded 1821. A few yards further, he stopped beside a patch of undisturbed earth, Clara's simple, unmarked grave. He didn't kneel or weep. His grief was a solid, internalized thing, hard as granite. Instead, he pulled a small silver gear from his coat pocket, a relic from a watch he'd been building for her 7th birthday. He placed it carefully on the soil. 5 years, Clara, he whispered, his voice dry and raspy. The machine is set in motion. The first wheel turns. He adjusted the brim of his hat and continued walking, leaving the silence of Black Creek behind. His destination was Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where the flamboyant Reverend Silas Albright was once again finding comfort and power in the adoration of a new flock. The first part of Elias's plan involved infiltration and the subtle manipulation of Albright's environment. He needed to find the chinks in Albright's new armor. He spent the next day observing the Reverend's new ministry, a large, newly constructed wooden tabernacle. Albright's sermons were charismatic, full of fire and brimstone, designed to terrify and then comfort, assuring the congregation that only he held the key to their salvation. Watching Albright preach, sweat beading on his brow under the dim gaslights, a raw, cold satisfaction settled in Elias's stomach. The man was a performer, utterly reliant on his audience's belief. That night, under the cover of a freezing drizzle, Elias made his move. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried a small, intricate metal tool, and in his mind, the blueprint for a perfect, terrifying illusion. He scaled the back wall of the tabernacle and slipped inside. The building was dark, echoing and smelled of cheap incense and the stale air of 100 bodies in close proximity. His target was Albright's private office, a sanctuary of plush velvet and heavy oak. Elias expertly picked the lock, a skill honed by years of manipulating tiny clock mechanisms. Inside he went straight to the large, ornate pulpit lectern which Albright used every Sunday. Elias wasn't going to harm the man physically. He was going to make him doubt his sanity, his faith, and his very control over his world. Working quickly and silently, Elias unscrewed a small panel at the base of the lectern. Inside the hollow wood, he carefully placed a tiny, custom-made clockwork mechanism, a miniature, perfectly silent device powered by a finely tuned spring. It was designed to do one simple, devastating thing. At precisely 3 a.m., 5 minutes before Albright's daily, solitary pre-dawn prayer ritual, the mechanism would release a faint, almost imperceptible sound, the sound of a young girl weeping. A sound only Albright, kneeling at the pulpit, would be able to hear. As he left the tabernacle, melding back into the dark alleys of Lancaster, Elias glanced up at the slate-gray sky. The drizzle had stopped, replaced by a cutting wind. The silence of Black Creek had been traded for the anxious anticipation of Lancaster. He had started the clock. The slow, meticulous process of psychological breakdown had begun. Call to action. If you're gripped by Elias's calculated quest for justice, don't miss a moment of this intense psychological thriller. Subscribe to the channel right now and hit the notification bell so you're the first to see how Elias unravels the dark secrets of the Exorcists, one terrifying move at a time. The atmosphere in Lancaster the next morning was deceptively normal. The street lamps extinguished as the weak October sun struggled to burn through the persistent haze. Elias, now posing as a traveling clock repairman named Mr. Vance, had rented a small, nondescript storefront a few blocks from Albright's tabernacle. He spent the morning conspicuously polishing brass and oiling pocket watch gears, a tableau of harmless industry. But his true attention was fixed on the grand oak doors of the ministry. Reverend Silas Albright was a man of immense, if fragile, ego. His entire persona was predicated on his unshakable authority and connection to the divine. Any crack in that foundation would be catastrophic. The day passed without incident. Elias ate a solitary supper of cold meat and bread in his new quarters, the rhythmic tick-tock of his repaired clocks a counterpoint to the thrumming tension in his chest. He reviewed his log, charting the expected response. Albright was scheduled to preach that evening. Elias needed to observe the ripple effect. As dusk settled, casting long, menacing shadows down the narrow streets, Elias walked to the tabernacle, joining the flow of the faithful. The crowd was eager, clutching their Bibles, their faces a mixture of expectation and quiet dread, the perfect emotional soil for Albright's fiery rhetoric. Albright took the pulpit, his posture rigid, his usual booming introduction unnaturally subdued. He launched into his sermon, a familiar diatribe against the unseen evils plaguing their modern life. But something was off. His eyes, usually scanning the crowd with magnetic zeal, darted repeatedly toward the base of the lectern. His hand, resting on the ornate wood, seemed to tremble slightly. Elias, sitting near the back, noted the subtle signs. Albright missed a rhetorical beat. He stumbled over a well-worn passage of scripture. Then, during a dramatic pause meant to amplify his power, Albright flinched visibly, his head cocked, as if listening to something only he could hear. "The wicked," Albright roared, attempting to regain control. "They hide in the shadows. They whisper in the night, in the silence of your most solemn moments." He wiped his brow with a silk handkerchief, his breathing shallow. A few congregation members exchanged confused glances. Albright's performance was usually flawless, mesmerizing. Tonight he was agitated, distracted. Elias understood. The clockwork mechanism had done its job hours ago, releasing its agonizing sound into the pre-dawn quiet of the empty tabernacle, a sound tied irrevocably to the worst memory of Albright's life, the whimpering of a small child just before the flames. The sound would now be an oral phantom, a seed of self-doubt planted in the Reverend's subconscious, blooming into paranoia. Albright wouldn't attribute it to a simple mechanism. He would attribute it to the only thing his mind could rationalize: retribution. After the service, as the crowd dispersed, Elias waited. He knew Albright would seek counsel, but not from the local ministry who might question his stability. He would go to the one person he could trust to understand the spiritual attack, one of the other exorcists. Elias had already foreseen this. He had painstakingly intercepted and copied Albright's previous correspondence. He knew the Reverend maintained a guarded, if sporadic, written communication with Father Thomas Dwyer, the second target. Just as Elias suspected, a young church deacon was dispatched quickly into the rainy night, clutching a sealed envelope. Elias, maintaining a safe distance, followed the deacon to the nearby train station. The letter was bound for Philadelphia, where Father Dwyer now served as an academic chaplain at a prestigious, quiet seminary. The next day, Elias did not wait for the letter to travel. He bought a ticket to Philadelphia. His goal wasn't just to terrorize Albright. It was to use Albright's panic to locate and confirm the weaknesses of the others. The three men, though acquitted, were bound by their shared secret, a lethal bond that Elias intended to exploit. The journey to Philadelphia was long and monotonous, the train rattling through sodden fields and industrial slums. Elias found a grim satisfaction in the city's vastness, a place where one could truly disappear. He arrived in the bustling, historic city, and immediately went about establishing a new cover. In Philadelphia he became Mr. Thorne, a historian with an interest in early church archives, a persona designed to get close to a man like Dwyer. Father Thomas Dwyer, unlike the theatrical Albright, was an intellectual. He dealt in structure, doctrine, and the cold, unfeeling logic of the church. His sin wasn't zealotry, but cowardice, a refusal to stop a dangerous ritual and a subsequent silence that damned an innocent child. Elias spent a week in the dusty, silent corridors of the seminary's library, his face buried in volumes of ancient texts. But his ears were tuned for any mention of Father Dwyer. He learned that Dwyer was respected but distant, a man who preferred the company of dead philosophers to living peers. His routine was rigid: library work, private study, and late-night prayer in the seminary's chapel. Elias's plan for Dwyer had to be equally intellectual and isolating. While Albright was broken by sound and spectacle, Dwyer would be broken by text and logic. One afternoon, while the father was conducting a mandatory lecture, Elias slipped into the seminary's rare book archive, a place where a historian was allowed access. He located a specific 17th-century theological volume he had researched. With the tools of his watchmaking trade, he expertly opened the binding of the book, carefully inserting a single folded sheet of paper deep into the spine. The paper contained a passage Elias had meticulously penned. It was written in a perfect imitation of 17th-century script, an archaic style of Latin, detailing a lost, forgotten doctrine of spiritual retribution, one that specifically mentioned the consequence for a silent accessory to a wrongful death committed under the guise of piety. The text was phrased not as a threat, but as a chilling, authoritative verdict. The intention was to make Dwyer believe he had stumbled upon a genuine historical condemnation of his own actions, a doctrine that suggested his failure to intervene in Black Creek had already spiritually doomed him. Later that week, Elias saw his plan take effect. Father Dwyer, in his reserved study space, found the inserted document. Elias observed from a discreet distance as the father's face, usually a mask of calm intellectualism, drained of color. Dwyer spent the next several days frantically cross-referencing the text with other volumes, growing increasingly pale and drawn. The clarity of his structured world was dissolving. A few days later, Elias saw the same hurried, anxious action he had seen in Lancaster. Dwyer, now looking haggard and profoundly fearful, sent a telegram, not a letter, to the third man, Dr. Gideon Hale, now practicing medicine in Baltimore, Maryland. The panic was spreading. The three men were being drawn together by the very fear that had once bonded them, a fear Elias was now meticulously orchestrating. Elias adjusted his spectacles, the cover of a benign historian firmly in place. He had finished his work in Philadelphia. The next stage of the machine was ready. Baltimore, Elias murmured, consulting his journal. A medical man's vanity is his competence. We will see what happens when that is taken away. The train ride out of Philadelphia was marked by the steady, hypnotic clicking of the wheels on the rails, a sound that now seemed to keep time with the methodical, cold beat of Elias's purpose. Baltimore, Maryland, in late November was a city of damp, industrial decay and burgeoning medical professionalism. Dr. Gideon Hale had managed to carve out a comfortable existence here, leveraging his experience, or perhaps his notoriety, to set up a respectable private practice focused on internal ailments. Hale was the least religious of the trio, a pragmatic opportunist whose sin was greed and the betrayal of his oath. He had confirmed Clara's possession with a clinical detached lie. Elias, still using the identity of Mr. Thorne, arrived in Baltimore and quickly secured lodging near Hale's practice. He spent days studying Hale's routine, noting the brisk, self-important manner with which the doctor interacted with his well-to-do patients. Hale's pride was his precision, his air of scientific certainty. The first two targets had been attacked through their domains. Albright through his pulpit, Dwyer through his texts. Hale would be attacked through his patience and his medical certainty. Elias's new cover was that of an affluent gentleman with a chronic, undiagnosable malady. He managed to secure a private consultation with Dr. Hale. The doctor's office was opulent, smelling faintly of carbolic acid and expensive cigars. Hale, a man with a sharp, calculating gaze and impeccably groomed beard, listened with professional detachment as Elias described his fictitious symptoms. Intermittent vertigo, sharp, localized muscle twitches, and an unnerving, profound sense of deep, cold dread that manifested unpredictably. "My previous physician was baffled, Doctor," Elias stated, meeting Hale's eyes. "He suggested it might be a nervous complaint, but I feel it is deeply physical." Hale, eager to prove his superior diagnostic ability, put Elias through a battery of physical examinations. He tapped, probed, and listened, his face slowly shifting from confident engagement to slight confusion. The symptoms were textbook, yet the physical signs were absent. "Mr. Thorne," Hale finally concluded, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "Your reflexes are sound, pulse is normal. You exhibit classic signs of neurasthenia or nerve weakness. Nothing physically threatening. I appreciate your candor," Elias said, feigning relief. But there is one more detail. The previous doctor mentioned that the symptoms seem to intensify whenever I am near a source of intense heat or in the presence of old wood smoke. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Hale's professional mask cracked. His hand, resting on his mahogany desk, clenched. A flash of fear, cold and pure, crossed his eyes before he quickly regained control. "That is highly unusual," Hale stammered, his composure momentarily lost. "I suggest a period of rest, avoid stimulants, and perhaps a consultation with a specialist in psychological afflictions." Elias knew he had hit the mark. The connection to the Black Creek fire had unnerved Hale far more than a simple diagnosis should. The true mechanism of attack began later that week. Elias, utilizing his watchmaker skills, had crafted several extremely small, almost invisible irritants. Tiny shavings of fine allergenic dust mixed with a specific custom-blended residue that smelled faintly of old charred oak. Working under the cover of a dense fog, Elias managed to introduce these irritants into the ventilation system of Hale's clinic and into the seals of Hale's personal medical instruments, the tips of his stethoscopes, the air release valve of his blood pressure cuff, and the velvet lining of his spectacle case. The symptoms were subtle, insidious, and tailored. When Hale used his instruments, a phantom smell of smoke would appear, subtle and quickly dissipating. His patients exposed to the irritant would begin to report their own vague symptoms: a phantom itch, a localized tremor, a feeling of airlessness that seemed to defy physical explanation. Over the next few days, panic began to grow in Hale's clinic. Patients started to question his diagnoses. The elegant Dr. Hale, the man of unwavering scientific certainty, began to look frayed. He started re-examining his tools with frantic suspicion, convinced his clinic was being tainted or that his own diagnostic abilities were failing. His confident exterior withered into open anxiety. The ultimate blow came when a prominent patient, a wealthy merchant, began to report Elias's exact fictitious symptoms: vertigo, twitches, and the profound cold dread. The merchant publicly demanded a second opinion, implying Hale's practice was either incompetent or the source of the mysterious affliction. Hale, desperate to salvage his reputation, became obsessive, isolating himself in his study, poring over medical texts, searching for a physical malady that didn't exist, all the while inhaling the phantom scent of smoke. Elias had engineered a medical mystery that undermined the only thing Hale truly valued: his professional authority. Hale was consumed by a silent, scientific terror, the fear of utter diagnostic failure and public ruin. The final piece of this stage was the telegram. As with the others, Hale's terror drove him to reconnect. Elias, positioned at a public telegraph office, intercepting a messenger boy, read the message before it was delivered. It was addressed to Father Dwyer, who, as Elias expected, was still in Philadelphia, struggling with his own spiritual crisis. The message was brief, frantic, and chillingly revealing. "The symptoms have returned. They are in the air. Need immediate consultation. The accounting is beginning." Elias smiled a thin, grim line. Hale's use of the word accounting suggested a deeper, shared knowledge of the possibility of retribution. He had successfully tied all three men together with a web of paranoia and fear, driving them towards a physical meeting. The machine was accelerating. Elias packed his bag. He had no more business in Baltimore. The men were now in motion, drawn by their terror back toward each other and unknowingly toward the man who had set their destruction into motion. He headed toward the Central Rail Depot, not toward Philadelphia, but toward a small isolated hunting lodge in the wooded hills of western Pennsylvania, a location he had discovered in the old, archived legal paperwork. It was a place the three men had retreated to immediately after the trial in 1867, a place of shared secret, and the perfect stage for the final act. The hunting lodge was a rustic, secluded structure nestled deep in the Pennsylvania woods, hours by carriage from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where a group of men could disappear for a few days without drawing suspicion. a perfect hideaway for three men trying to absorb the shock of an acquittal and the crushing weight of a child's death. Elias knew they would choose it as their rendezvous point. It was a place where they felt safe, and that was exactly why it had to be their undoing. Elias arrived in the region a week before the expected meeting. He spent his days scouting the terrain, moving through the dense early winter woods with the silent efficiency of a seasoned hunter. The air was frigid, the ground covered in a thin, crusty layer of early snow. He found the lodge, a two-story log structure with a large stone fireplace and a rickety porch, its wooden bones creaking under the weight of years. He set up a clandestine base in an abandoned trapper's lean-to a quarter-mile away, close enough to observe, far enough to remain invisible. His work here was purely infrastructural. He needed to prepare the setting, turning the lodge from a place of refuge into a cage. His first action was to ensure isolation. The single winding dirt road leading up to the lodge was notoriously prone to landslides in this season. Elias, using simple tools and his knowledge of geology and physics, carefully destabilized a section of the road a few miles down the mountain. It wasn't a visible obstruction, but a calculated weakness. A heavy storm, or the passage of 3 carriages, would be enough to collapse it, effectively sealing the men in. Next came the subtle psychological preparation of the lodge itself. Elias was meticulous. He examined the main living area, where the 3 men would inevitably gather around the fireplace for comfort and counsel. He noticed a small ornamental clock on the mantel, its mechanism rusted and long dead. A perfect canvas. Elias replaced the inert mechanism with a custom-built apparatus. It wasn't a sound device this time, but a finely calibrated olfactory trigger. The device was timed to release a minute, highly concentrated burst of a specific, chemically recreated scent, kerosene and wet ash. The scent would be released directly into the updraft of the chimney on the second night of their stay, the moment when their initial panic had subsided and a dangerous sense of security might begin to settle in. It would be a phantom smell, one that would immediately transport them back to the fire, but only for a moment, leaving them uncertain and questioning their sanity. The most critical preparation involved the structural integrity of the lodge's attic and the main meeting room below. Elias discovered a small, rarely used dumbwaiter shaft connecting the first-floor pantry to a storage closet in the attic. This shaft was his secret access point, his mechanism for observation and further manipulation. On the 3rd day of his surveillance, Elias saw the first arrival. Reverend Albright, stepping out of a hired carriage, looking gaunt and jumpy, constantly scanning the woods. He looked like a man expecting a judgment, not a consultation. His clothing was disheveled, his usual confidence replaced by a thin veneer of forced piety. The next day brought Father Dwyer. The priest emerged from his carriage looking physically ill, his movements slow, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. The intellectual attack had crippled him. He carried a leather-bound folio stuffed with handwritten notes, clearly his frantic, failed attempts to disprove the archaic Latin text. Dr. Hale was the last to arrive, 2 days later. He looked the most physically put together but the most psychologically unstable. He was argumentative with the driver, constantly checking his pulse and muttering to himself as he scanned the skies. The sight of the 3 men together, finally, brought a chilling sense of culmination to Elias. That evening, Elias was positioned in the attic. He was not there to act, but to listen. The lodge was silent until well after nightfall, when the 3 men gathered downstairs. Elias lowered a tiny, sound-gathering horn, a watchmaker's listening device adapted for his purpose, through the dumbwaiter shaft. He could hear their voices, muffled but clear, carried up the stone chimney. I tell you, Silas, it was a sound only I could hear. Albright's voice, usually a preacher's roar, was a desperate whisper. The child, weeping. It was in the very wood of the pulpit. Self-reproach, Silas. Dwyer's voice, strained and academic, responded. A neurological reaction to prolonged guilt. I am dealing with something far more insidious. A text. It suggests our acquittal was merely temporal, that the divine judgment is imminent. Nonsense. Hale's voice was sharp, yet brittle. "It's all psychosomatic, rooted in that accursed fire. But I swear, Tom, my instruments, they smell of smoke. My patients are reporting symptoms of profound cold dread, the same sensation the girl must have felt before she died." He didn't finish the sentence. The shared silence that followed was heavy with guilt. Albright broke it, his voice laced with the old zeal, now warped by terror. "It's a spiritual manifestation, a curse. We must prepare a new rite, a cleansing." "No more rites, Silas," Dwyer snapped. "It was the rites that got us here. We need to understand the source of the threat." Hale's response was cold, pragmatic. "The source is irrelevant. The threat is exposure. If this accounting, as the message called it, continues, we will lose everything. We need to discredit the source, whatever it is, and we need to do it before the whole story surfaces again." Elias Thorne, listening from the cold silence of the attic, felt a rush of cold, clinical satisfaction. They were terrified. They were cornered, and they were already turning against each other, their fragile bond of mutual secrecy beginning to fray. He packed up his listening apparatus. Tomorrow the mechanism for the smell of smoke would be activated, but tonight a new, more immediate fear was necessary. He had to remind them that the environment itself was hostile. He quietly accessed the exterior of the chimney. Using a long, flexible wire, he delicately introduced a small, concentrated piece of dry ice into the chimney's flue, just above the main firebox, where it was still warm. Minutes later, a thick, unnatural white smoke began to plume from the fireplace, not the blue-gray smoke of wood, but a chilling, scentless fog that quickly filled the room, accompanied by a sudden, intense drop in temperature. Elias listened as the three men cried out in panic, their voices muffled by the sudden, overwhelming condensation. They were surrounded by a manufactured cold mist, a horrifying reminder of the death they had caused, not by fire, but by the icy grip of fever and fear. The lodge, their haven, had turned against them. The thick chemical fog that had filled the lodge dissipated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the three men shaken, freezing, and frantically accusing the other of carelessness with the fire. Elias, observing from his distant lean-to, noted that the confusion and fear had achieved its purpose. The men were no longer seeking comfort in their shared space. They were isolated by suspicion and profound psychological terror. The next day was one of forced, anxious civility. Albright retreated to his room, locking the door and muttering prayers. Dwyer remained downstairs, frantically reading and writing, trying to find a theological explanation for the manifestation. Hale, ever the man of science, spent the morning examining the fireplace, looking for a physical source for the sudden cold and fog, finding nothing conclusive. Elias knew the scent mechanism was due to be triggered late that night, but he needed a stronger lever to truly fracture their alliance. He needed a character who could penetrate their isolation and force a public conflict. He thought of the only person from Black Creek who had shown Elias kindness, a woman who had tried to testify against the men, but was silenced by community pressure. Martha Giles, a seamstress who had known Clara. Martha, a woman of unshakable moral strength, now lived in a small town not far from the lodge. Elias had kept in contact with her discreetly and rarely, ensuring her safety. It was time to bring a witness to the scene, not to confront, but to observe, to provide Elias with the external, truthful perspective the men were desperate to avoid. Elias sent a coded message to Martha via a trustworthy itinerant delivery man. A simple, non-threatening request to meet him at a specific abandoned mill near the woods, mentioning the names of the men. He knew her sense of justice would compel her to come. While Martha was en route, Elias initiated the second major psychological attack on the three men, focusing on their shared vulnerability, the official record of the fire. He returned to the lodge under the cover of a freezing windstorm, using the same entry point to the attic. He had brought with him a meticulously created forgery, a short, official-looking document designed to look like a confidential addendum to the original 1867 trial records, complete with embossed seals and faded ink. The text was a bombshell. It stated that due to a recent review of the medical examiner's notes that had been suppressed during the initial trial, Clara's death was reclassified not as accidental, but as death by criminal negligence, aggravated by malicious intent. The document went on to state that the original jury members were being recalled for a potential retrial. The most terrifying part: the document was dated for the next day. Elias expertly slipped the document into the inner pocket of Dr. Hale's winter coat, which was hanging on the coat rack in the main hall. Hale was the most likely to look for evidence, and the one whose past medical dishonesty made him most susceptible to believing a new, damning record had surfaced. Elias then returned to his post. The tension in the lodge was a palpable thing, a low, constant hum of anxiety. As night fell, the wind howled outside. The fireplace was roaring, the men trying to banish the lingering cold and dread. Suddenly, the scent mechanism, activated by the warmth of the roaring fire, discharged. A sudden, minute puff of air hit the chimney's updraft, carrying the phantom scent of kerosene and wet ash. "What is that smell?" Hale coughed, his face pale. "Did you spill something, Silas?" Albright's eyes were wide with terror. "I smell nothing. It's the smoke. The smoke is speaking to us." Dwyer, his head in his hands, groaned. "It's the guilt, gentlemen. It's the stench of our shared sin." As they argued, Hale reached for his coat, intending to flee the room. His hand slipped into the pocket, finding the unfamiliar crisp paper. He unfolded it under the gaslight, his eyes scanning the archaic legal language. The effect was instantaneous. Hale's face went from pale to ashen. He let out a strangled gasp, dropping the paper. "Retrial," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Criminal negligence. Malicious intent." They found the notes. Albright snatched the paper, his eyes frantically scanning the forged text. "A lie, a forgery. This is not real." "It has the seal, Silas. The date. They've been quiet for 5 years, and now this is the accounting." Hale shouted, his control finally shattering. He pointed a trembling finger at Dwyer. You sent that telegram. You've been corresponding with someone who is trying to destroy us." Dwyer, utterly overwhelmed by the mounting evidence of his impending doom, sank into a chair. "I only wrote to Hale and Albright. I wrote to no one else." The argument descended into a frantic, panicked exchange of accusations. They were no longer allies. They were 3 rats, trapped in a closing box, each pointing a desperate claw at the other. The mystery was working exactly as Elias intended. It wasn't the evidence that mattered, but the belief in the evidence. Just as the argument reached a fever pitch, a loud, distinct crack echoed from down the mountain. The sound of shifting earth, of timber snapping, the sound of the road collapsing. The 3 men froze, terror replacing panic. "What was that?" Albright stammered. "The road," Hale breathed, realization dawning, his face rigid with a new, external fear. "We're cut off. Someone knew we were coming here. Someone planned this." Elias, watching from his distant perch, pulled out his logbook. The confrontation was on schedule. The isolation was complete. He had one more piece to move. He would meet Martha at the mill and bring her back to observe the final horrifying steps of the men's collapse. The presence of a truly innocent witness would only amplify the terror for the men, reinforcing the inescapable nature of the judgment Elias was enacting. The game had entered its final, irreversible phase. The rendezvous with Martha Giles at the abandoned mill was brief and tense. The mill, a decaying stone structure by a frozen stream, was a fitting location for the meeting, a place where industry and life had stopped, leaving only echoes. Martha, a strong, weary woman in her late 40s, stepped out of the shadows, her shawl drawn tight around her face. "Elias," she said, her voice a low, steady current of concern. "What is happening? The men, they are here, after all this time." "Elias," His face, etched with years of sleepless nights, explained his plan in stark, measured tones. He omitted the mechanisms, focusing on the intention. "I have driven them here, Martha, to the place they hid after the fire. They are terrified. They believe a new trial is imminent, that they are cursed. They are turning on each other. You want me to—" "What?" she asked, her eyes wide with apprehension. "I need you to confirm their terror," Elias said, his voice hard. "They need to know that the one person they wronged most, Clara, is still being remembered. I need you to go to the lodge at dawn. Do not confront them. Simply observe from the edge of the clearing. Let them see you. They know you tried to testify for Clara. Your presence is the living proof that their crime cannot be buried." Martha hesitated, her gaze distant, fixed on the rushing water beneath the ice. "Elias, this is dangerous. What if they hurt you? Or me?" "I have ensured their safety is my priority, Martha," Elias lied smoothly. His priority was his daughter's justice, but he knew Martha would not assist a bloodbath. "My aim is not to harm them. It is to force them into a complete confession and collapse. They need to break down in front of a witness who carries no institutional bias. You are that witness." Her resolve hardened. "For Clara, Elias. Only for Clara." Elias led Martha to a carefully concealed elevated vantage point overlooking the lodge clearing, a place where she could observe without being easily seen. He then returned to his lean-to, preparing for the final devastating manipulations. The sun rose on a clear, brutally cold morning. Elias could see the smoke curling lazily from the chimney, but the activity around the lodge was minimal. Albright and Dwyer were inside. Hale, driven by his scientific need for answers, was outside, examining the collapsed section of the road, a sure sign that the isolation was confirmed. Hale returned to the lodge looking frantic, his medical certainty completely eroded by the inescapable reality of the blocked road. He burst into the main room, slamming the door shut. Elias listened in via his acoustic horn, the dumbwaiter shaft his unseen ear. "It's no accident. The road was deliberately collapsed. We are trapped, I tell you." Hale screamed. "Hale, control yourself," Dwyer pleaded. "We must think rationally." "There is no rationality here, Tom. There is only a coordinated attack. The symptoms, the smell, the fake document, it's all connected. Someone is doing this." Albright, whose nerves had completely frayed, began to pace like a caged animal. "It's the devil's retribution. He is using human hands to carry out his sentence." Suddenly, Albright's pacing brought him to the window overlooking the clearing. He stopped dead, his hand shot out pointing a rigid finger. "Look," he hissed. "There, in the trees, I see her." Hale and Dwyer rushed to the window, shielding their eyes from the morning glare. Martha Giles, standing perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, her dark shawl blending with the shadow of the pines, was looking directly at the lodge. She made no gesture, offered no greeting, simply stood, a silent, moral reproach. For the three men, Martha was not just a woman. She was a spectre of their past, the living embodiment of the guilt they had suppressed, and the only person who could truly confirm their fear of public exposure. "Martha," Hale whispered, the name a raw exhalation of fear. "She knows. She's here for the retrial. She's the witness." Dwyer's intellectual defenses finally collapsed. He sank to his knees, clutching his head. The doctrine, the silent accessory. She is the one who sees our spiritual contamination. Albright, however, reacted with a desperate animalistic rage. This is it, the final stage of the attack. She's working with the authorities. She's come to corner us. We have to leave, now. Albright rushed for the back door, desperate to find an escape route through the woods, away from the witness. Hale, equally panicked, followed, grabbing an iron poker from the fireplace, his scientific reserve replaced by primitive fear. Dwyer, however, remained on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, accepting his fate. Elias watched the two men flee into the woods, their terror making them reckless. This was the moment. The final mechanism had to be set in motion, the confrontation that would expose the true nature of the crime. Elias sprinted from his lean-to. He needed to be physically present for the next stage, but only to observe and protect Martha. He ran a circuitous route to keep himself hidden, moving silently and quickly through the dense frozen brush toward the path the two men had taken. The hunt was no longer simply psychological. It was now a desperate flight and pursuit, with Elias controlling the ultimate direction. Elias, moving like a phantom through the pines, stayed 50 yards behind Albright and Hale. Their flight was clumsy, fueled by raw panic. They were not tracking the path. They were simply running deeper into the dense, unfamiliar woods, their fear of Martha's witness a more immediate threat than the wilderness. They were heading toward the abandoned quarry, a deep, jagged pit of loose rock and muddy water, a feature Elias had factored into his final calculation. He paused, ensuring Martha was safe and hidden. He then reached into his coat and pulled out a small metallic whistle, a specialized tool used by surveyors. He blew a single, sharp, high-pitched note, a sound that, due to the atmospheric conditions and the specific location of the quarry, would echo unnaturally, seeming to come from multiple shifting directions. The two fleeing men stopped dead. "Did you hear that?" Albright gasped, clutching his chest. "It's a signal. They are surrounding us." "It's the police. They've flanked us," Hale shouted, his terror causing him to misread the simple sound. He raised the iron poker, his face contorted. Dwyer, who had been struggling to keep up, stumbled and fell, landing hard on the icy ground. "Wait! It's just a sound. Don't you see they are playing with us? It's psychological." But the other two were beyond reason. Albright, convinced he was about to be captured and tried for murder, turned on Hale, his eyes blazing with a desperate self-preserving instinct. "It was your fault, Gideon. You lied about the diagnosis. You told us it was possession. You signed the death warrant." "I told you what you wanted to hear, you sanctimonious fool," Hale roared, swinging the poker wildly, narrowly missing Albright's head. "You were the one pouring the oil. You were the one driving the ritual. It was your zeal that killed the girl." The years of repressed guilt, the mutual blame, and the desperate fear of exposure finally erupted into a violent, chaotic struggle. They grappled in the mud and pine needles, their carefully constructed lives dissolving into a brutal, humiliating fight for survival. Elias watched from the shadows, his face devoid of emotion. He was not intervening. He was allowing the mechanism of their own guilt to play out. Dwyer, lying on the ground, watched the spectacle with horror. He raised himself on one elbow, his voice weak but clear. "Stop. Look at us. We are proving the accusation. We are savages. We are exactly what the community feared we were, murderers." His words had no effect on the struggling men. Albright managed to wrestle the poker away from Hale. He raised it, his face contorted in a mask of homicidal panic. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the air, a sharp, clear voice. "Stop it! You've already killed one child. Are you going to kill each other now?" Martha Giles, having emerged from her hiding place, had run toward the chaos. She stood on a small rise overlooking the struggle, her face a picture of righteous indignation, her hands clasped in front of her. She was not afraid, she was furious. The effect was instantaneous. Albright froze, the poker held high. Hale stopped struggling. Dwyer simply stared. Martha's voice was the voice of Black Creek, the voice of the community they had betrayed, and the voice of the innocent life they had taken. "You called her possessed," Martha continued, her voice ringing with clear, cold truth. "She was just a child with a fever, Elias's kind little girl, and you all stood there and let it happen, too proud, too greedy, or too afraid to stop it." Albright dropped the poker, the clang of metal against rock echoing through the silent woods. He sank to his knees, his shoulders shaking, not with rage, but with a profound, terrifying recognition of the truth. Hale, seeing the moral authority of Martha's presence, the inescapable collapse of his partner, and the final crushing weight of his guilt, stumbled backward, his eyes fixed on the cold, muddy water of the quarry pit, barely 50 feet away. The sight of the deep, dark water seemed to promise an end to the terror, an escape from the truth. Dwyer, who had crawled to his feet, made a last, desperate plea. "Please, Martha, it was not malicious, it was fear, blind, terrible fear." "Fear is no excuse for murder, Father," Martha replied, her voice unwavering. "And what you did to Elias, leaving him alone with his grief, you all deserve the truth to find you." Elias, still hidden, watched as the final domino fell. The fear of external judgment had been replaced by the shattering internal judgment of their own consciences, facilitated by the one person whose moral weight they could not dispute. Albright began to sob uncontrollably, his confession a ragged sound lost in the trees. Hale simply stood, a broken, silent statue. Elias knew his work was complete. The three men were utterly destroyed, not by physical harm, but by the weight of their own actions, exposed in front of the one person who mattered. Justice had been rendered. He turned and walked away, deeper into the woods, leaving Martha to deal with the broken men. He had achieved what the courts could not. He had forced the accounting. Elias Thorne did not look back. His steps were firm and steady, no longer driven by the frantic urgency of revenge, but by the quiet, heavy resolve of a man who has completed a difficult, necessary task. He walked in the opposite direction of the main road, deep into the uncharted woods, leaving the broken figures of the Exorcists and the unwavering presence of Martha Giles behind him. He knew what would happen next. Martha, a woman of deep moral convictions, would secure help. The collapse of the road meant the men would be stranded for a time, but Martha would ensure they were found. Albright and Dwyer, broken by confession and spiritual terror, would likely seek official recourse, not out of penitence, but out of a desperate need to cleanse the soul or find legal protection from the phantom threat. Hale, facing complete ruin, was an unknown quantity, but his fear of public exposure was now a far greater prison than any physical enclosure. Elias's biggest threat now was not the men, but the trace he might have left. He had to disappear with the same meticulous efficiency he had used to set his trap. He walked for hours, navigating by the position of the sun and the silent knowledge of the old forest he had gained during his reconnaissance. He reached a tiny, almost invisible stream he had marked on his personal map. Following it led him, as planned, to an old, abandoned logging trail, a path rarely used and known only to locals. He paused and pulled out his logbook. The accounting. Final entry, December 1st, 1872. Targets: Albright, Dwyer, Hale. Action: completed. Psychological collapse achieved via orchestrated exposure and isolation. Public witness, Martha Giles, confirmed the breaking point. Result: forced confrontation of guilt. They will carry the weight of Clara's death no matter the legal outcome. Their lives are over. Status: mechanism fully disassembled. Retreat initiated. He tore the journal into tiny, unreadable pieces and scattered them into the running stream, letting the cold water carry the evidence away. He then checked his pockets, ensuring he had no tools, clippings, or documents that could link him back to Lancaster, Philadelphia, Baltimore, or the tragedy in Black Creek. His pockets held only a small sum of cash and the clothes on his back. As he walked, his mind returned not to the horror of the chase, but to Clara. He realized the weight that had been pressing down on his chest for 5 years had shifted. The desire for vengeance, which had been a consuming, corrosive fire, had banked down to a cool, quiet ember of justice. He was not healed, but he was no longer paralyzed. The psychological burden he had carried was slowly being replaced by a more practical challenge: survival and a new life. He reached the end of the logging trail and found the small, pre-arranged cache he had established weeks earlier: a sturdy pair of new boots, a fresh, neutral-colored jacket, and a plain canvas satchel. He changed clothes, burying his dark, travel-worn coat under a pile of dead leaves and rock. The grim uniform of the hunter was discarded. He was now simply Mr. Vance again, the traveling clock repairman, But this time, the name was not a mask for a killer, but a shield for a quiet survivor. He walked into the nearest town, a tiny community called Stone Ridge, at dusk. The town was unremarkable, its main street lined with a livery, a general store, and a small, functional rail depot. He booked a room at the local boarding house, establishing his cover with the simple, authentic details of a man who worked with his hands. That evening, he sat in the common room, the scent of wood smoke comforting and natural, not a manufactured terror. He listened to the town gossip, a habit he had picked up to track his targets, now used as a means of assessing the outside world. There was no talk of a manhunt, no news of a massive collapse in the woods. His meticulous planning had paid off. The collapse of the road would be seen as a natural event. The breakdown of the three men would be attributed to their shared, traumatic history and the stress of their isolation, a common-sense explanation that fit the known facts. The forged document would likely be dismissed as the product of one man's delusion. He knew the silence would not last forever. When the men were found, the story would break, but it would be fragmented, circumstantial, and highly localized. No one would connect the mysterious incidents in Lancaster, Philadelphia, and Baltimore to the final confrontation in the woods. Elias Thorne had erased his tracks perfectly. He had one final responsibility: Martha Giles. He needed to know she was safe and had not been implicated or harmed. The next morning he located the Stone Ridge post office. He wrote a brief, carefully worded letter to Martha, addressing it to her hometown, making no mention of the men or the fire, simply expressing gratitude for her recent kindness and promising that the matter of the accounting is now entirely closed. He signed it simply, "An old friend." He mailed the letter, a final connection severed. He would leave Stone Ridge by train the next day, heading south toward a new life in a new city. He chose Cincinnati, Ohio, a bustling industrial city on the border of the West, a place where a skilled tradesman could easily find work and anonymity. As he stood on the platform waiting for the train, watching the smoke plume into the cold morning sky, he felt a profound exhaustion. The 5-year burden was lifted, replaced by an emptiness that felt vast, but not terrifying. It was the space to rebuild. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the man consumed by revenge. He was simply Mr. Vance, the watchmaker, a man now ready to live by the quiet, steady rhythm of the clock, not the frantic, destructive beat of a hunter's heart. Cincinnati, Ohio, was a loud, vibrant city, a chaotic blend of commerce and industry along the bustling banks of the Ohio River. The scale of the city was a psychological relief for Elias. Anonymity was a guarantee here. No one cared about the haunted history of a small Pennsylvania town. He settled into a modest apartment above a quiet haberdashery in a working-class district. The rent was paid in advance, and he quickly set up a small, legitimate watch and clock repair shop. The tools that had been used for vengeance were now used for their original, peaceful purpose. The meticulous care, the precision, the deep understanding of complex mechanisms, all were channeled into the quiet, honest work of making time function. He adopted a strict, almost monastic routine: early to bed, early to rise, work that required absolute focus. His life was the rhythmic tick-tock of a dozen different clocks in his shop, a constant, comforting reminder of order. He never read the newspapers. He never sought news from Pennsylvania. The story of the three men was irrelevant to his future. He had enacted his justice, and their fate was now a matter for the police, the community, and their own broken minds. The true challenge of this new life was not the fear of being caught, but the silent weight of memory. Every clock he opened, every tiny gear he handled, was a reminder of the mechanism he had built for Clara, the beautiful timepiece she would never wear. One rainy afternoon, a young man entered his shop. He was a kind-faced, earnest apprentice from a nearby engineering firm tasked with repairing a large, antique wall clock. The apprentice, named William, was struggling with the complexity of the mechanism. Elias, still reserved but now less guarded, patiently showed William how to identify the flaw, a hairline crack in a crucial escapement wheel, and how to forge a replacement using his specialized tools. "It's not just about fixing the brakes, Mr. Vance," Elias explained, his voice low and steady. "It's about understanding the intention of the maker, why he placed the wheels where he did. It's a philosophy of structure." William was instantly captivated by Elias's depth of knowledge and quiet precision. He began to visit the shop regularly, ostensibly for advice, but truly seeking the company of the quiet, wise craftsman. This unexpected connection was the first truly human contact Elias had allowed himself since Clara's death. William's presence, his genuine interest in the trade, began to chip away at the fortress of isolation Elias had built. One evening, William brought him a tin of hot stew from his mother. They sat in the small, warm shop, the tick-tock chorus surrounding them. "You're an incredible mechanic, Mr. Vance," William said, stirring his stew. "Why didn't you open a larger shop? You could be famous." Elias paused, taking a slow sip of his broth. "Fame is a dangerous thing, William. It brings attention. I prefer a quiet life. I find peace in precision, in things that work exactly as they were designed." He did not mention that his last design had been one of retribution. As the weeks turned into months, Elias found a new purpose in mentoring William. He was teaching more than mechanics. He was teaching focus, patience, and the value of honest, clean work. He was passing on the part of himself that was good, that had not been corrupted by rage. One crisp spring morning, William burst into the shop, holding a local Cincinnati newspaper. His face was a mixture of excitement and concern. "Mr. Vance, look at this, a story from Pennsylvania." Elias took the paper, his heart giving a single hard thump against his ribs. The story was brief, relegated to a back page, a follow-up to an old, nearly forgotten incident. The headline read, "Black Creek Fire Acquittees Face New Scrutiny. 2 Confessors Institutionalized." The article detailed the official findings after the incident in the woods. Reverend Silas Albright had been committed to an asylum, raving about fire, weeping children, and divine retribution. Father Thomas Dwyer had voluntarily left the priesthood and committed himself to a quiet sanitarium, completely broken by what he called the inescapable judgment of conscience. Dr. Gideon Hale had vanished. The authorities suspected he had fled the country, unable to face the public disgrace and the lingering phantom symptoms he himself had inflicted upon his former patients. The article concluded by mentioning the testimony of Martha Giles, who recounted the men's dramatic collapse and mutual accusations, confirming the community's long-held suspicions about the nature of the exorcism. The paper stated that, while the old charges could not be officially reopened, the men's lives and reputations were irrevocably destroyed. Elias read the story, his face impassive. It was the final confirmation. The justice had been total, and it had been enacted by the men themselves. He handed the paper back to William. "A tragedy of human weakness, William," he said, his voice calm. "The greatest mechanism of all is the human mind. When it turns against itself, nothing can stop the destruction." William nodded, not fully understanding the depth of the comment, but sensing the gravitas. Elias picked up a partially repaired pocket watch. He focused on the tiny, delicate balance wheel. The past was now a closed book, its pages turned and sealed. He was finally free. The following year saw the continued quiet rebuilding of Elias Thorne's life in Cincinnati. He was now known in the district as a master craftsman, Old Man Vance, whose work was precise, reliable, and possessed of a subtle, almost philosophical patience. His mentorship of William deepened, the younger man becoming the son Elias had lost, but in a different, profound way, a connection of shared purpose and respect, untainted by the ghosts of Black Creek. Elias had made peace with the outcome. His revenge was not about bloodshed. It was about the restoration of truth and the infliction of a justice that transcended the failings of the legal system. He had forced the men to live out the horror they had caused Clara, and in doing so, he had forced them to condemn themselves. One cold evening, a stranger entered the shop. He was a well-dressed, educated-looking man, slightly older than Elias, with a cautious, thoughtful demeanor. He introduced himself as Mr. Peterson, a traveling solicitor from New York, ostensibly in Cincinnati on business. "Mr. Vance," the man said, his voice smooth and professional. "I've heard you are the most discreet and skilled watchmaker in the city. I have a rather unusual job for you." He produced a small, leather-bound box. Inside was an intricate, beautiful, but non-functioning music box. The mechanism was far more complex than a typical timepiece, designed to play a specific, haunting melody. "This belonged to my sister," Peterson explained, his eyes distant. "It's sentimental. She passed away years ago. I need it repaired, but more importantly, I need its internal workings to be documented. Every spring, every gear. I need a complete, precise schematic of its function. My sister, you see, was fascinated by mechanics." Elias looked at the music box. The melody, Peterson hummed, was a simple, childlike tune. The request for the schematic was indeed unusual, almost obsessive. He agreed to take the work, intrigued by the complexity and the depth of the man's attachment to the object. Over the next 2 weeks, Elias painstakingly disassembled the music box. He drew schematic after schematic, noting the manufacturer's marks, the customized tension of the springs, and the clever, almost unique design of the cylinder that held the notes. As he worked, a chilling, distant memory began to surface. The design of the custom-made parts, the signature way the movement was encased. It reminded him of the specialized, high-quality work done by a particular European master watchmaker who had once traveled through Black Creek years before the fire. Elias had studied this master's work obsessively in his youth. On the final day of the repair, with the music box functioning perfectly, Elias found a hidden inscription on the underside of the main spring housing. It was tiny, almost invisible without magnification. It was a name, A. Thorne. It wasn't Elias's mark, but the mark of his own father, an accomplished, secretive master watchmaker who had abandoned Elias and his mother decades ago. Elias had always believed his father was long dead, a ghost from his past. Peterson returned to collect the music box and the schematics. "You've done remarkable work, Mr. Vance," Peterson said, carefully examining the schematic. "The detail is astonishing. It truly is a document of its function." "Mr. Peterson," Elias said, looking directly at the man, "I found an inscription on the spring housing. A name, A. Thorne." Peterson's professional demeanor wavered for the first time. He looked genuinely startled. Then a profound sadness settled over his features. "You are a remarkably observant man, Mr. Vance," he said quietly. "My sister was indeed fascinated by mechanics, and she was a dear friend of the Thorne family for a time. She was Clara's maternal aunt, and the music box was a gift from my father, who was, for a time, a mentor to Elias Thorne's father." Elias felt a cold rush of realization. The man was not simply a solicitor, he was related to the tragedy. "What do you plan to do with the schematics, Mr. Peterson?" Elias asked, his voice a barely audible whisper. Peterson placed his hand on the drawings, his expression resolute. "My family never trusted the outcome of that trial. My sister's grief was profound. I have spent the last 5 years gathering evidence, much like you, I suspect. The schematics are my way of understanding the mechanism of the crime, the way it was built, the way it was timed." He looked at Elias, a recognition dawning in his eyes, a final, stunning realization of the identity of the man before him. "You understand mechanisms, Mr. Vance," Peterson said, his voice dropping to a low, knowing tone. "I believe you understand the mechanism of justice better than anyone. It's no coincidence I found you. The true accounting for that fire, it was a work of profound, calculated genius. A mechanism built to force the truth. The world knows the outcome, but it doesn't know the hand that set the gears in motion." Elias Thorne, the watchmaker, looked at the schematics of the music box. The detailed, precise documentation of a perfect, quiet mechanism. He saw the metaphor. His entire scheme of revenge was a complex mechanism designed and executed with flawless precision. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He had not confessed, but he had been seen, understood, and silently absolved by a man who sought the same justice. "The work is completed, Mr. Peterson," Elias said, his voice finally clear and free of its 5-year-long wait. "The mechanism is now at rest." Peterson took the music box and the schematics, gave a small, respectful bow, and left the shop, disappearing into the chaotic, vibrant life of Cincinnati. Elias was left alone with the chorus of his clocks. He had hunted the men who burned his daughter and had achieved a justice far more absolute than the law could provide. He was free, his soul cleansed not by an acquittal or a confession, but by the quiet, perfect operation of his own meticulous, terrible design. The clockwork of vengeance was finished. The clockwork of a new life had begun.